Today we're looking at building better funding models through and beyond the Covid-19 crisis with MzN International, a not-for-profit consultancy that MzN has a very close working partnership with. We're delighted to have Joseph and Christian from MzN here today. The session is recorded. We'll send out a link to it later on, together with the slides. We'll be taking, it'll be about 25 minutes of presentation, 25-30 minutes of presentation. If you have questions during the session, drop them into not the chat box, but the Q&A box. The chat, you can talk to other people, but with use the Q&A box to ask questions. A really interesting session because I think lots of people realise, and this applies to both the international development sector as well as the domestic charity sector, about how vulnerable charity funding models are or have been exposed to be by the current crisis. But I think everyone's recognised that there were issues even before this crisis arose. So it'd be interesting to see what Chris and Joseph have to say about this. Without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Chris to start the morning. Morning, Chris, and morning, Joseph.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody in the UK, domestic and international. I hope you're all well. This, I know, is not your first, and it certainly won't be your last webinar. I hope you're not webinar tired yet. So I'm hoping that we go through the presentation a bit faster than usual on this one and have more of an interaction together after this one. Good. So my name, just a brief introduction, my name is Christian MzN. I'm running MzN International. I'm joined today by my colleague Joseph.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone.
And we'll take you through very quickly through sort of funding models because it's our privilege and honor and also our job to actually work with a lot of charities and social enterprises to get that one right. And as Mike already said in his introduction, this is an area where many organizations have, for very good reasons, maybe not the strongest one. So the things we'll be talking about today will be that we first of all recognize that funding is of course not our first priority. We are non-for-profits, but how do we square that to get our model right? Then we have a brief look at the funding in the current pandemic, as well as the principles of a good income stream. So we can't give the answer to every organization in a 20 minutes webinar, but there are some principles we can apply. We're going to have a quick look, Joseph, and take a quick look at the donors' response in the pandemic. That will be more general, not specific opportunities. If you're interested in more specific opportunities, then you can join this afternoon's webinar about that. Then we look at some practical steps to take home of building a sustainable income stream. And hopefully that will lead to a good conversation afterwards. Right, so first things first, let's recognize the fact that we are non-profits. And that immediately puts a conflict in our chest, at least, because funding is not and shouldn't be the number one priority. Delivering your mission, delivering your mandate really is rightly and should be rightly your number one concern. And that I completely sign up to, and that's something that funding consultants sometimes get wrong as well. Funding should be mandate driven, not the other way around. It's very important that we get the right type and obviously the right amount of funding to deliver our mandate in the along the steps and along the lines of the strategy that you as leaders in your organizations have set, not that some donor has set. But the problem is that funding is almost a bit like the first challenge we all have to overcome, and it's a recurring one, one that we have to get across ever so often. And everybody knows that the lack of funding is obviously a problem, but the wrong type can be just as big. I always refer to funding as a bit of the ultimate backstage pass to various plays happening at your organization, because it basically influences a lot of key areas of how you deliver your mandate. It obviously dictates your short-term liquidity, as some of us notice right now very severely. That seems very obvious, but it can also drive decisions like what costs can you actually incur and what do you invest in. If your funding doesn't allow you, even though the total amount might be sufficient, doesn't allow you to make these crucial investments or keep costs in a certain area at sufficiently high levels, then to build capacities in your organization that you need to deliver your mandate, then you will not get there. So also your pipeline, this is another really key part. Your funding pipeline, when you go from a concept node, for example, on an institutional donor, towards negotiations, towards proposal, towards negotiation, or when you line up and you're in conversation with a philanthropic partner, or you're setting up an income generating activity, your funding pipeline, and I've seen this over again, sometimes dictates your strategy more than your intentional strategy does. And we want to avoid that, obviously. We want our strategy to be shaping our funding pipeline, not the other way around. So at this time, but really at any time, we need to get funding right. And that will be one of the key conditions to get to that next normal that we will all experience. Well, let's have a quick look at how the world funds the COVID response. And maybe that can inspire us to have a quick look at how we should run our funding model. Now, COVID funding is actually quite diversified. We have these, we're looking at who actually funds it, and we're looking, it's not just one government or one big foundation or one major UN organization that everybody gets behind. It's very much diversified. And that's something we've seen for the last 15 years, this fragmentation of funding sources. And COVID-19 has behaved exactly along the lines. We have about bilateral government notices of about 20 to 22% that are specifically COVID focused. About another rounded 20% is funded by the World Bank as the single largest sort of donor on the COVID. The private sector and the foundations are stepping up almost equally. And then we have the EU and others with funding there. That others includes UN subcontracting, World Health Organization, etc., etc. So again, nothing new there. Unsurprisingly, what is being funded is health. But that's not exclusively so. Health is just over half of what is being funded. Inclusive development, particularly in the EU, particularly for foundations and the World Bank, plays a major role. And others are still over 25% of the current COVID funding that is being released in the last 4 weeks. That is a very significant portion. And I think we can all expect major humanitarian response needs and response sign-ups happening later this year, for example, to counter a famine that everybody unfortunately is expecting. If we look at where, again, the regions are quite diverse. East Asia and Pacific is around 60%, West Africa and with 14%, and North Africa, Middle East, 10%, and the same one with South Asia. But still, the other regions are exactly half that funding. So there is, the message to take home is that the COVID funding follows the trend of the last 10, 15 years, that donors are splitting up. There's not one big national donor, that the themes are varied, and where they are applied are well. So the question is, what funding model then? How should we devise a funding model for you? What funding model is actually right? So let's look at what funding is out there. That is a fun slide. Again, these slides will be shared. We purposely do not copyright our slides, so please feel free to share that if you find it useful. There are other funding sources. On the top you see here the red, you see the funding sources, and yes, there are other ones available. These are sort of the main ones. The government grants, traditional grants, most of you will be familiar with that. or your EU grants would be covered here as well. Service contracts, which I know many of you are familiar with. Any income generating business you might have, that would be the Oxfam shops, for example, or a regular consultancy based on your programmatic expertise that you're selling, and your fundraising campaigns, of course. That would be your unrestricted, your global appeals, or your national appeals. Then you have your intergovernmental grants. That would be your UN funding, for example, or your World Bank, intergovernmental bodies that are sub-granting projects to implementing partners. And finally, your foundation funding. With foundation, this is a bit split. This includes large, very institutionalized foundations that Joseph will talk about a bit later more as well. Things like Gates, MasterCard, etc. As well as small, more flexible foundations. Or foundations that are quite sizable, but are very flexible in their appeal, like Portuguese, for example, where they say we intentionally don't institutionalize our funding process. These smileys, you can argue with, but by and large, in our experience, working with a lot of NGOs, working with a lot of social enterprises on funding, this is what we experience. Going down the government grants, there is really very little flexibility in how we use the funds. Like donors have become a bit more flexible how to repurpose existing funding pipelines towards the COVID response, but they would still struggle to use a humanitarian grant suddenly for development work or completely different work. Without a crisis, the funding is very restricted, hence its name, restricted funding. Cost recovery and profitability is all known to you. I mean, yeah, if it gives you the 7%, or you might have a NICRA rate from the USAID, but I'm yet to see an NGO partner that can truly recover all costs associated to obtaining, managing a program through the grant there. The level of effort refers to the level of effort involved in securing the funding. So again, using the example of a DFID grant, for example, or an FCO grant in the UK, a government grant, that is mediocre, I would estimate. So there are some hurdles, there are large proposals necessary. The negotiation takes a significant bite and chunk of time and resources, but it's not terrible. Setting up, for example, a fundraising campaign or an ongoing global campaign takes a lot more, hence the sad face under there. With level of effort, what work is required to keep the donor happy once you have secured the funding? The reporting associated to a government grant is severe compared to many other forms of funding. And that begs the question sometimes, I don't know how you feel, but sometimes when I was at Save the Children, for example, I wondered, who do we actually work for? Our users, our beneficiaries, or the donor? Because the latter certainly gets a lot of attention, and a lot of information, and a lot of reports. The longevity and sustainability are key strategic questions that we need to consider when looking at our funding model. A government grant is not sustainable. The exit route here, yes, you can obtain follow-on funding once, twice, maybe even 3 or 4 times, but it always has an end date. An ongoing private partnership, for example, or an ongoing income generating business has a longevity and a sustainability to it that ensures or guarantees as much as it can your funding for much longer time than the 3 to 4 years that the grant covers. So that's longevity and sustainability are key considerations in designing your funding model. And same to that is the recurring and the repeatability. Yes, sticking with the example, a government grant can repeat a couple of times in their follow-up contracts. You've proven that you've done well there, for example. But by and of itself, it is not repeatable. It has an expiration date. So can you just send the same proposal again in 3 years' time? Definitely not. Whereas a fundraising campaign, for example, is repeatable. with maybe slight changes. But once you build the structure, the infrastructure there, it's a very long play, even though expensive to set up. The key from this slide to take home here is, and there are other forms of funding. There's private sector partnerships, and there is other things that need to be considered. Is that this just is a very rough and ready overview about what characteristics the funding has that should match your mission and the way you operate. Definitely just going for one side is not the answer. And definitely ignoring other sorts, even though they might be expensive or long-term to set up, can also not be the answer. So hopefully that slide helps trigger some thoughts and some discussions internally. Right. Moving on, and we could refer back to that in the questions. Here's sort of 3 no-go areas of absolutely how not to fund your mission. Never, ever, and I can't believe I have to still say that, but we still see organizations that rely on a small number of donors and an even smaller number of types of funding. That is a recipe for disaster. It will go wrong. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when, particularly with this dynamic, very flexible and agile environment that we now live in. There's also a moral consideration. I asked a few of my colleagues then and saying, if an NGO is almost exclusively funded by one or to a major part funded by a governmental donor, are they really still an NGO, a non-governmental? Can they credibly claim to be free of undue influence if 70, 80, or even 90% of the funding comes from one government source, or one government, maybe 2 different ministries? That is, I think, is a moral question that transcends the funding one, that will also require us to diversify our funding, even if the funding overall at the moment is sufficient in amount, but not in type. And then ultimately, I don't know how you feel, but I really want to avoid the chase. When I was the finance director at Save the Children in South Sudan, there was this search grant, run a grant, then panic, and then repeat the same thing again. I'm really tired of this. I understand that running a grant takes a lot of resources. So does panicking 6 months before the grant runs out. It's also fundamentally not sustainable to make half your staff redundant at the end of a grant. That is not how you build up expertise, knowledge, learning cycles, and reputation, frankly. Good. Joe, I think this one is over to you now, right?
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. First, I'm going to sort of run through, I mean, this is going to be a very, very high level look at sort of what's going on in the funding world in sort of 4 core groups. I mean, it's an endless subject, and we have another webinar this afternoon that goes into some more detail of some specific areas. But just to sort of give an overview as to what's going on, or what the sort of sense of what's going on is. So from an institutional perspective, and we're including EU and UN, you know, anything that's a kind of multilateral or a sort of large entity kind of donor is included in that, really. We've seen an increase in funding, 1,500 or so new initiatives that have been released since the sort of beginning of the pandemic. Many of them are sort of medically focused or pandemic specific. However, many are also not. We've also seen this kind of almost universal approach to flexibility and reassignment, where the figure we've arrived at is about 20% of development funding being repurposed to sort of COVID response. Actually, we've experienced in some countries with some donors significantly more, and in some cases much less. But that's really about saying that there's money out there and it's committed, and it's, you know, whilst the original mission is incredibly important, there is also something that's very timely that we're facing that needs to sort of be appropriately funded. And I think the final point here was, I think I might have heard it from 3 or 4 kind of relatively senior sources, that this pandemic and its response is dominating the sort of the news, the funding streams, the funding searches. People are searching for funding, COVID-19 funding, but actually the sort of underlying humanitarian and socio-economic action that's that is most of those organizations' long-term mission are sort of mutually reinforcing to having a sort of a safe and healthy population. So where possible, those things are being implemented. They're continuing to be funded. The pipeline is not being reduced in favor of COVID-19 funding, and actually they sort of see once the kind of response part of the COVID crisis sort of reduces, they imagine that the pipeline is probably going to be increased when it comes to the kind of recovery sector. So there was significant action and significant kind of positive news in that sense from institutional donors. Philanthropic partners. Now we've been working quite a lot in the US with large or largest philanthropic foundations. And what we've noticed is that particularly the US government, it's happened in other countries as well, but the US government has been incredibly generous with the tax incentive to promote increased giving. So anyone who has a family foundation that's run through a philanthropic advisory firm are really being sort of advised or even sort of, encouraged actively to sort of spend, particularly during this year, particularly during that crisis, to really, there is some altruism there, but there is also a significant tax saving for them, and that's obviously encouraging a lot of them to kind of increase their spending. On a more general note, we've noticed over time philanthropy as a sort of body, as a kind of range of partners, it's becoming more institutionalized, and you've got the larger ones, which we'd all know, but there are many smaller foundations, family foundations that are out there that offer really flexible, really interesting grants, or many other sort of funding methods that are becoming increasingly part of a diversified funding mix. And actually, we find often the cases where you find smaller family firms, and you find a good match between an NGO. The sort of discussion and debate about what can be implemented is often incredibly interesting. Chris, if we could slip to the next slide. You've probably already done it, thank you. The fundraising. So this is talking really about private fundraising, or kind of the standard fundraising. We've noticed, now this is partly anecdotal, I think, from the UK and Europe, from speaking to our partners, and actually partly very scientific, because we had a very good report provided to us from a US perspective that sort of cemented these numbers. So we've seen roughly 80% of charities have suffered a decline in varying degrees of fundraising on an individual basis since the beginning of the pandemic. But about 20% have seen not only an increase, but a significant increase. Now, in our experience with our clients, that increase has come across the board. In the US, it looks like the significant increase has predominantly been health focused. And I would say the number of our partners that do have clinics or in some way sort of health related activity do seem to be the ones that are receiving the greater amounts of funding. Lots of our partners who often relied on perhaps a face-to-face way of gaining fundraising have obviously had to change that very quickly, and social media and sort of personal one-to-one calls for with kind of registered donors or registered kind of people that are giving have been a sort of, I'll say a statistic, and I'll be very cautious about checking the report again, but I think there'd been an increase in about 45-50% of activity moving from other methods into sort of social media contacting and social media campaigns to boost fundraising, because everyone's at home watching telly, using a tablet at the same time. There's so much media going on trying to keep people stimulated that's the way they've managed to keep focus. The last bit that we'll cover is a sort of income generating business. And now, Chris mentioned the Oxfam shops. during the sort of initial thing, which, you know, I think that is a very interesting one in itself, because they've obviously been closed, which would have, you know, created the sort of the opposite of what we'd normally imagine from an income generating sustainable aspect of a business. So, you know, it's very, very variable, but we've noticed a number of our clients or a number of our partners, particularly that still work in the field and have a kind of distribution network and have, you know, kind of a network on the ground. They've really been able to access procurement contracts, either as the sort of main contractor, but also with as partners, particularly doing distributions where they would normally perhaps do wash distribution. They've now, you know, completely been able to sort of maximize their opportunity and take on procurement contracts, supply many things across the field that have suddenly become in increased demand. So that's the sort of general, you know, the broader scheme. You know, we are seeing commercial contracting becoming a more and more popular approach, and I'm sure everyone has had a sort of discussion or a debate about that, and I think it's ongoing about the sort of opportunities and challenges there. But, you know, I think this crisis won't do anything to stop the move towards aid funding going through commercial contracting, and, you know, it may even accelerate it. Okay, so the final part before we stop talking and we can start dealing with some questions, it's really about sort of 10 practical steps for sort of building a sustainable income stream. And we go through these with lots of our partners, and you know, some have a very good funding strategy, others it really is a sort of secondary thought, and the answer is probably somewhere in the middle of those two. So tip 1, diversification of funding and revenue streams is key. Step 2, having a minimum funding level. You know, we work with partners who apply for grants sometimes that are $20,000, $50,000. And, you know, when we sort of understand the you know, they've spent 40 hours, 6 people have spent 40 hours putting together a proposal, of which the sort of the underlying cost of that proposal really isn't understood. So really we need to understand our cost, what it costs us to apply for things, you know, where it becomes valuable to apply for grants, and really sort of set that level and kind of stick to it. The same goes for the management fee or the gross margin of which you can achieve from those contracts. You know, when we go into partners that have financial difficulty, very often the first thing that we find and the first thing that we see is you've got grants being implemented overseas, and the sort of administration costs in the head office is 15 or 20%, of which the grant can recover 7, 8, 10% sometimes more. And that sort of, you know, structural deficit between what it costs to administer a grant from a headquarters perspective and what it costs from the grant really causes problems, and that's something that needs to be understood. You know, where costs can be allocated better. There are many ways of dealing with that, even if the sort of cost recovery amount isn't negotiable. You know, set those parameters that from 1, 2, and 3, and stick to them. You know, they can be hard and fast rules, and I don't think it's detrimental to sort of stick with those, particularly if they're focused around your mission. The 5th point is have a system to systematically review and assess opportunities, develop a checklist, develop criteria which make something that can move on to the next stage of really looking whether it's worth applying for, and keep that, make it a system, make it systematic, make it regular. As soon as it becomes ad hoc or, you know, a sub responsibility of someone who has a huge expansive job, you know, that falls by the wayside, and the pipeline really disappears. So if you could go to the final slide, Chris.
Yep.
Thank you. So the final sort of practical steps are, you know, Chris mentioned it earlier, you know, make sure that you're looking for funding that supports your mission, or looking for entities that will support your mission, not moving your mission to suit the funding opportunities that are out there. I mean, it's very easy to say, but we do come across clients that have obviously chased grant funding, and whilst perhaps they're in a financially sustainable position or in a financially good position, they're so far away from their original mission statement, their goal and their aim, that there's 2 very separate things going on. And one thing has to change, and it makes it a very complex process. Participating flexibly in these things. Lots of entities are always used to applying for the grant or applying for the contract as the lead, and that gives them a certain amount of confidence, and that's the position they know. But working as a subcontractor or an associate with all of those grants, gives you that broad spectrum. It means that someone actually might take on the workload of applying, and you can spend a much less time and get a meaningful part of the operations using just specifically your expertise on a small part of a much larger project. For those in the UK, I think it probably has already been said and already been done in many cases. If we're going to keep the EU funding as an opportunity, then find an EU partner. That will make your lives a lot easier. And then the final two parts are really about having the ability to prepare and write proposals. Business development, income development should be part of business as usual. In fact, perhaps it even should be a separate department. It's something that's incredibly important. And what tends to happen is it gets left to someone in the program management department who doesn't have the time to really do it properly. And it gets done ad hoc, and it's done in that sort of panicked fashion. And it really doesn't have a sort of long kind of pipeline that's relatively confident of some of that coming through. And to sort of top on that, it's really about, there will be times when you find 2 or 3 grants that are really, really sort of suited, or 2 or 3 opportunities that are perfectly suited for you to undergo. And it's having that sort of surge capacity in your proposal writing team to really kind of, put all behind it to make sure that those grants go in if they are the ones that you've systematically identified as being the kind of next funding opportunity that you're going to go for. So I think I'll pass back to Chris. That's me done, and he can sort of close everything off, and then we can go to your questions.
Yeah, I'm actually closing off straight away, Joe. Thank you very much for covering that. So obviously the bond funding working group and Zoe is at your disposal, and that's going really well. And also you can ask Joseph and myself. I've been trying to answer a few questions in the Q&A section already whilst Joe was talking. I don't listen to you normally, Joe, anyway, so I thought I'll do that. Now over to the question and answers by Mike.
Great, thanks very much, Joseph and Chris. If I may, I've just had some very interesting data through from Bond's own survey of members just this week, which shows some very interesting facts actually about current COVID funding. I don't know whether you know, but I think DFID's strategy has been not to necessarily fund civil society organisations directly, but to try and get funds through multilaterals. And our survey of about 81 members, which is about just under 20% of our membership, is showing really there are severe problems in that funding coming through from multilaterals, from DFID country offices. And although the bulk of these organisations are actually, of these 81 organisations, I think 76 of them are actually working on a COVID response. Most, just under half, are doing that without any additional funding from anywhere. So I think that's really interesting. And going back to the point that Joseph made earlier on about philanthropic giving, those organisations that have acquired additional new funding have acquired it from philanthropic sources. So it's the real sort of failure, I think, in the multilateral pipeline, and I think it will get there eventually, but it's not. What we're seeing is a big failure of the system to get funding to organisations on the ground quickly. So going back to Chris's chart earlier on of government funding with all its sort of downward turning smiles, I think that it's slow, and I think that's what we're seeing also in the UK domestic sector in terms of frontline funding for NHS-focused charities. They're not getting, if the funding was announced 2 months ago, it's only just coming through. So that's just an observation from the bond perspective. So, some questions. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Chris or Joseph.
No, only that I want to say that, UK funding in particular is changing massively, and it's not always to the benefit of INGOs. DFID has had a long strategy now already for many years, well before Brexit as well, to find more social enterprises and businesses, frankly. They've always said that private sector partnering should be the norm, not the exception, and that's something we at the NGOs struggled with. And then lastly, the changes between the de facto split off towards the FCO, and then Brexit has made this all very difficult. I did have a conversation with someone at DFID yesterday, and I'm not afraid to repeat it here. Giving money to multilaterals in a COVID response is, on the donor side, obviously the least amount of effort. You can claim to have contracted out large amounts of funding in COVID without having run a compliant and professional procurement process. And so I do suspect a bit of a political motivation here. Not that that practically actually helps us here.
Okay, so in questions, we've got startup Denis Kovalenko has asked, where does funding from corporate partners sit in this spectrum of funding opportunities?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Try to answer the question whilst Joe was talking there, along the lines there as well. It's one of these I haven't mentioned. You can add 3 or 4 other ones, like income bonds or impact bonds. They're not covered there either. In terms of corporate partnerships, we've seen, Joe, and you can comment on that from our experience over in the UK and in Geneva, we've seen them working really well and some of them working really badly. And the cringe point is your value proposition aligned? If the private partner, given any business, is just using it as a tax deductible and feel-good CRM scheme, then it tends not to be working beyond the 2 years, frankly. However, if it's in line in the business, if you have a exchange between private company employees who can also do mini internships at the NGO and vice versa, if there's a joint visits to program areas, then it seems if that alignment gets closer beyond the money, then it works much better, and also the funding is much higher and it actually increases over time. And the owners or the shareholders start seeing that as an inherent part. The big drive here, Mike, and I may just say that we're seeing a massive drive starting on the East Coast and West Coast of the US and coming over to Europe right now, of businesses adjusting to what they call the new normal, the new operating model. And for the first time, I'm really quite excited about this one, for the first time, that new normal includes the social role. Large economic areas here in Germany, for example, and across the EU say, customers are very happy to pay a premium, pay more, i.e. increase the company's profit margin if that company stands for a social good. And that social good needs a non-profit partner. So that's where we see a lot of change happening, and that's where I think in the next 3-4 years, there's if we start now, is a major opportunity to diversify towards a much better funding model.
Great, thank you. One, I think this is for Joseph really, but Alison Marshall, concerned about the diversion of funds to COVID, the reprioritization towards health and WASH, and delays to donor decisions on other or new funding windows, and the potential for that to create problems in the pipeline for next year. Can you say a bit about what you know about that, Joseph?
Yeah, I mean, I think the concern is probably real. I think there's definitely an ambition to keep projects being sort of implementing projects that aren't that aren't impacted by COVID-19. There's a willingness to immediately put them, anything that is impacted on a no cost extension. There is definitely a commitment to keeping the pipeline of new funding opportunities in their sort of original, kind of areas of operation, so non-COVID work. But I think, it seems to be everything at the moment, that there is obviously a shortage of kind of personnel to deal with those things very, very effectively. So I think pipeline for sort of 2021 whilst I think it will come, I also think it will probably be delayed, not through, you know, anything other than actually the ability to for them to assess and sort of go through any of the kind of procurement opportunities. You know, everyone's working on reduced capacity, everyone's working from home. So we're seeing, you know, sort of response times, whereas normally we sort of get round through to the first round of shortlisting in sort of 2 weeks. We're perhaps now seeing that being closer to 6 weeks. And there is always a reassurance that these things will come through. But I think there is a real concern that it will come at the sort of at a much kind of slower pace than perhaps was anticipated. I think that's, you know, I think that's really I think there's an ambition to get it done properly and done timely, but I think that the sort of overwhelming sort of capacity is reduced, and that will see you know, the sort of non-COVID related decisions pushed, you know, early into 2021, if not to the back end of 2020.
Absolutely.
And
may I just say the same goes for that previously mentioned contracting to the international organizations. If the UK, as well as other institutional donors, push a lot of money into the intergovernmentals, the World Bank, the UN system, for example, then they have to get that out as well. Now they're experiencing severe limitations there too.
it's worth saying also, Bond's got a meeting with a very elusive Secretary of State later on today, and one of the things that she's interested in discussing is the prioritisation of DFID funding in the context of a falling gross national income. So meaning that the value of 0.7% declines. What does that mean for prioritisation? Where should funds be spent? So they're already anticipating those questions and looking for interesting ideas and answers from our sector. You know, also that will affect. It may be that it's sort of larger, the extent of funding that goes to multilaterals that's affected more than to civil society organisations, but who can say? It's very early days in that discussion.
Yeah.
Yes. Felicity Jones, could you give a more, if possible, a more detailed breakdown in terms of where funding is going? As a fundraiser for Sub-Saharan Africa, for a Sub-Saharan African organisation working in community health, we have not seen so much of the funding focused to date on SSA. It would be interesting to see how this large and obviously deeply impacted global region is or isn't a focus in COVID-specific funding. I'm also interested in the potential role of other types of funding, such as impact investment, and any thoughts you have on that. So, Sub-Saharan Africa as a region and impact investment.
I'll take Sub-Saharan Africa, if you want to take impact investments. It's a really difficult one to answer, blasé, and I'm sorry for the purpose of this webinar to have to lump SSA into the other section. We see, for example, that French and Italian funding is prioritizing the African Mediterranean region, so the North Africa region, plus selected country in SSA. So, for example, Nigeria or Senegal is a priority for French funding, and therefore also for EU funding with predominantly French money. Also, in terms of trading partners, the German funding, which has just increased now and is now the largest donor, the single largest donor in Europe, is going along the lines of main trading partners. So we are getting an increased amount of funding going into Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and into some funding into South Somalia. Somaliland. So there we have additional funding. Different donors, I mean, we see, for example, the US is now prioritizing South Africa as a major funder, a recipient country, even though they also got their own donor agency. So that's interesting how that lines up. So I think the question can only be answered donor specific, I'm afraid.
I'll sort of say something very quickly about impact investing, because I think it probably warrants an entire session in terms of its sort of functionality, its sort of usefulness, and it's a way to apply for it. I mean, it's definitely becoming a sort of increasingly important agenda item for many types of business. I think probably the US is really leading the way, but it's definitely making its way to Europe. I mean, it's one of those, at the moment, I don't understand, or I don't rather know where there is a sort of central resource in terms of really accessing what and sort of understanding what the opportunities are. But, you know, it's very much, I mean, often it's a private sector play on in terms of, you know, really creating social impact with their investments. But there are many kind of ways into it. I don't sort of know of a really good central resource, actually, which might be something that we should start looking at. But, you know, there is no doubt that it will grow, because it will play into lots and lots of the kind of aims, missions, ambitions, the tax implications. There will be many incentives to sort of improve and continue to increase the sort of impact investing sort of sector, let's call it.
I would just add to that, Joe, and I hope disagree with me, please, Mike, as well, if you don't, that the term impact investment is really muddled. When you hear investment, I always, as an accountant principally, think, oh, the investor wants a return at the end of his or her investments. I've seen the term frequently being used at Patagonia, a clothing company in the Netherlands, for example, where they use the term impact investments, but their return isn't money, their return is community engagement, or their return is a more secure supply chain, or a more diversified supply chain. So when that could also be, the term could be used as a corporate partnership. Right now, for example, companies in mainland Europe are diversifying their supply chain away from China to be more ready for the next crisis, which will no doubt come, or the next wave of this one, which also probably no doubt comes. And they are saying, we don't want to be a single sourcer at a Bangladeshi sweatshop again. We need to diversify. So a social investment return on our partnership here would be tying in the local population to make our supply chain more reliable. So that's another sort of return. I see the term being used up a lot at the moment. It's not always money return.
Okay, we've got a sort of a more internally focused question from Sabina here, but it's a very interesting one. Do you have advice on how to structure fundraising teams for success? Should we have a different team for different funding markets, US, UK, and for different stages of the funding cycle, respecting proposal writing stewardship? Obviously, in smaller organizations, that's often just one person, or you know, you may not even have a bespoke fundraising person at all. But what have you seen that's worked well in terms of the way fundraising teams are structured?
I think Sabina, is it?
Yes.
Sabina, thank you, Mike. I think, Sabina, that's a great question. And I think that question already shows the sort of the pragmatism about going. We're talking about funding here, but how do we actually secure it? There isn't a bland answer to this one. I've seen various models work and some fail, but here's two things to do and one thing to definitely not do. What I've seen in large organizations happening over again, that if a particular type of program is successful amongst your response, maybe that program manager is is approaching a donor, writing a bid, securing the bid, and then becomes the program manager for that recently secured bid. I'm not sure if you've seen this, Mike, as well, but that effectively the person who wrote the bid then becomes the program manager. And I see the sense in it. After all, you know the donor, right? But you're literally stripping out this grant and proposal funding capacity out of the organization for another 3-year, 4-year turnaround. That's not the way. There must be a handover. So that's definitely one thing not to do. And the other one is only look for funding as the Friday afternoon last resort. You know, quickly check on the notice boards then. That's definitely not what we want to do. As Joe mentioned, it needs to be a common, normally exercise that is firmly rooted in your routine, that has an online dashboard, and we can give you many examples of opportunities that is looked at. I've seen some great INGOs which use really smart and cheap, ridiculously cheap tools that put the opportunities with keywords in the beginning of the online dashboard, and instead of asking program managers to look at something on Friday afternoon or a week later, they ask everybody to justify why not to look at something. So they need to find reasons why not to apply. So that turned the owners around. And the last thing is funding proposals by the nature of their business, be they governmental, intergovernmental, corporate partnerships or fundraising campaigns. They go through surges. They go through mass. There's always this, we can always say by the diary, now we have to write 4 proposals and the next month 0. So you need a mechanism to add search capacity. Maybe via the bond funding group, maybe via an external consultant on standby, so to speak, so that you activate this search capacity when you need it. The last thing you want to do, and this will always happen, is not go for an opportunity simply because you have 3 others wants to go. The opportunity costs of doing that are simply too high.
Great, thank you. And going, to the other end of the spectrum, this is really Alison Marshall, who's from a smaller organisation. And I think this could be the subject of another webinar in itself, but she's talking about commercial contracts, in her experience being more risky, payment in arrears based on results, and take more effort both to set up and report on. She's looking for sort of advice as a small player in consortia commercial contracts. What would your advice be about commercial contracts in small organisations?
We have a client who we've just helped with a negotiation on on a commercial contract, and they're a 4-man band. It's really depends on the terms you negotiate. If your fee is high enough and the risk is lower, I would probably wonder whether I would call a commercial contract immediately inherently more risky than a grant, because if you don't do what you promise on a grant, you also have to repay the money. So it's probably very similar. One fundamental, and Joe, maybe you can comment that from your experience as well. One fundamental problem I've seen most smaller NGOs struggle with is that when they pitch a service that they can be paid for in whatever form, they either don't have the confidence to say, right, you can pay us, but please pay us every quarter rather than at the end of a 12-month contract. No commercial contractor would accept that, so why would we? And the other one is they don't really know their cost base. So that they suggest a super competitive day rate or a monthly fee or a framework agreement that is very competitive, but there's no way they can actually run this on a sustainable basis. So you've set yourself up to fail there at the very beginning. Knowing what your services costs, how much time you invest, and then adding a good 40% on top to make sure you're always in the green when things change, and they always do, is probably a good tip here.
I mean, I think I just echo what Chris, it's really about a mindset change to some degree rather than an increased or decreased risk. I've been working with a partner in Somaliland, not big, not international, but also not tiny, and sort of moving towards commercial contracts, and that's now making up quite a sort of significant part of their income. And it's really about just understanding, first of all, the reporting requirements between those and the grants that they were originally undertaking are different, but they're no more or less onerous. And really, the idea of sort of a grant pre-funding something being sort of without risk is really, not the case. The number of disallowables that we see when we're sort of going through audits, that leaves quite significant gaps in the budget, but it's a year later after it happened. So you end up scrambling to deal with that in a different way. So okay, the risk sort of feels more immediate, but it's definitely no more or less. But it's really about understanding things like a number of times, I think the sort of mind that the money wasn't going to come as a lump sum at the beginning. So their initial proposal was very low and actually required payments very infrequent. It's really about understanding how to sort of work that contract to your favor. And I don't mean that you have to sell out your soul to be like that, but it's really just about understanding the language that commercial contractors use and aligning your process with them to meet that. But we've seen great. It is difficult, and it's you really have to sometimes assert your value against a large sort of entity that's running it. But when it works, it can work incredibly well, and the sort of costs that you can recover for your to sort of administer it from a head office perspective, you can then or you can sort of put into an innovation fund, or you can use for other projects, is really, really, really valuable. And you might say, well, actually, we're not supposed to make, we're not in it to make a surplus. But if you don't take it, a private entity will take it, and they'll take that as profit. We've managed to get into the mindset of our partners that, if you can make a surplus on that and then reinvest that in your other projects, reinvest that in an innovation that actually you can really use that for good, rather than let another corporate entity take things on and, withdraw it as dividends at the end of the year. So it's really a mindset thing, I think, to get through.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph. One last question, I think, and then we'll close. It's around online donations, and Paul Drury says that we've seen online donations go through the roof in the past month, but these come at a price, as the processing charge for online donations can be significant at around 7%. So you need a new provider. What would you be? What's the question? What's the answer there?
I'm not sure which gateway you're using to process online donations. Obviously, the person paying and the ease of processing is key here. Going through credit cards will always be more expensive. I know that Stripe payments, and I think please don't swear, I think PayPal as well, have waived donation fees down to a minimum, or even completely waived, if you fund online through their services. Or they have done for instances where the PayPal account of the donor isn't tied to a credit card, something like this one. So there are ways to optimize it. Key here, of course, is to make it as easy as possible for the donor to do this, even if you have to suffer some fees. What we have also seen is that private donors are really reluctant to set up another profile on your website. They want to connect to an existing Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, and log in via that and make the payment, rather than type in the amount, predominantly because more than 60% of donations in the US, we have the Q1 figures already, are now being done on a mobile device. And as we all know, typing down these little things is just really annoying.
Thanks, Chris. And there, I think we'll bring it to a close. Thanks very much to Chris and Joseph for their support and the interesting questions that you've asked from the audience. Lots more to come from Bond in terms of webinars, and from MzN. We've got a whole series of events lined up. If you've got questions for us, please do email Bond, email Chris or Joseph. And if you're not already a member of the Bond Funding Working Group, you should really be. That's a place where lots of things are debated. We'll be issuing our latest survey results, particularly on how funding for COVID is going, where it's going to, what our members are saying about it. That may be out on tomorrow, maybe out early next week, but we'll keep you posted. Do keep tuning in, and look forward to seeing you soon. And thanks very, very much for taking part, and for Chris and Joseph again. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.